Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 9 November 2024. It is the 114th anniversary of the birth of Carroll Quigley, who was born in Boston, Massachusetts on this date in 1910. Some men are known for their books, and some men are known for their personal influence, often through teaching. Quigley was known both for his books and for his teaching, but it was his teaching of influential students at an influential school that secured his reputation. Since he taught an entire generation of students at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University from 1941 to 1976, he influenced many individuals within the U.S. government foreign policy establishment. This distinctive form of influence has given Quigley a distinctive reputation. Most professors who write on the kind of topics that Quigley covered aren't referenced by figures in the government, but Quigley was. As a consequence, Quigley has been criticized for reasons that have little to do with his work. For example, Scott McLamy once referred to, quote, the weird theories of the late Carroll Quigley, unquote, in his article, The Quigley Cult, which was published in George magazine in 1996, without telling us exactly why he thought Quigley's theories were weird. I actually think it's quite common to dismiss thoughtful works like those of Quigley simply because one doesn't hear about them continually throughout one's formative years, but this feeling of weirdness is merely a function of familiarity, or better, complacency. There's nothing at all weird about Quigley's theories, but there is a great deal that is unfamiliar in Quigley because he was an original thinker. And I like to point out that the Wikipedia article on Quigley uncritically references the McLamy article as though it's authoritative. Quigley's major books were The Evolution of Civilizations, An Introduction to Historical Analysis, originally published in 1961, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, first published in 1966, and Weapons Systems and Political Stability, A History, posthumously published in 1983. Quigley was a man of his time, and his books breathed the atmosphere of the Cold War, which seemed at the time to be a permanent feature of history. In my recent episode on Francis Fukuyama, I talked about how everyone thought of the Cold War as a fixture of contemporary history that would continue into the indefinite future. Tragedy and Hope is very much a book of its time, but Quigley does have some prescient insights into the history he did not live to see, and he involves a more abstract conception of history in the quest for more comprehensive understanding. The last division of Tragedy and Hope, Part 20, Tragedy and Hope, The Future in Perspective, is deeply invested in Cold War themes, but Quigley eventually transcends this outlook and begins to lay out a more abstract conception of human beings in relation to their history. Here is an example of this from the final section of Tragedy and Hope. Quote, in order to think about himself or the universe with the more abstract and rational end of his being, man has to categorize and to conceptualize both his own nature and the nature of reality, while in order to act and to feel on the less abstract end of his being, he must function more directly, outside the limits of categories, without the buffer of concepts. Thus, man might look at his own being as divided into three levels of body, emotions, and reason. Unquote. And then Quigley goes on to spell out what he means by the human being divided into three levels and how this manages to unite thought and action. Quote, the body, functioning directly in space-time abstraction, is much concerned with concrete situations, individual and unique events at a specific time and place. The middle levels of his being are concerned with himself and his reactions to reality in terms of feelings and emotions as determined by the endocrine and neurological reactions. The upper levels of his being are concerned with his neurological analysis and manipulation of conceptualized abstraction. The three corresponding operations of his being are sensual, emotional or intuitive, and rational. The sequence of intellectual history is concerned with the sequence of styles or fads that have been prevalent, one after another, as to what emphasis or combinations of man's three levels of operations would be used in his efforts to experience life and to cope with the universe, unquote. Although tied to a Cold War paradigm, Quigley transcended his circumstances not by imagining a near-term end to the Cold War and the new political paradigm to follow that of the Cold War, but through a distinctive conceptualization of his historical circumstances. Quigley's mind ranged widely and tended to abstractions that others dealing with the same topics never considered. For example, his posthumously published Weapon Systems and Political Stability, A History, did not narrowly consider weapon systems, but framed their development in the context of human needs, which in this later work he expands beyond the three levels described in the previous quote. Quote, "The scale of human needs forms a hierarchy 7 or 8 levels high, ranging from the more concrete to the less concrete and thus more abstract aspects of reality. We cannot easily force the multidimensional complexities of reality and human experience into a single one-dimensional scale. But if we are willing to excuse the inevitable distortion arising from an effort to do this, we must range human needs from the bottom to the top on the levels of 1, physical survival, 2, security, 3, economic needs, 4, sex and reproduction, 5, gregarious needs for companionship and love, 6, the need for meaning and purpose, and 7, the need for explanation of the functioning of the universe. This hierarchy undoubtedly reflects the fact that man's nature itself is a hierarchy, corresponding to his hierarchy of needs, although we usually conceal the hierarchical nature of man by polarizing it into some kind of dualistic system, such as mind or body, or perhaps by dividing it into the three levels of body, emotions, and intellect," unquote. Notice that at the end of this quote, Quigley is criticizing his earlier position that I just quoted earlier, and he has expanded on it here. In a sense, we could say that Quigley has here recreated the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, though Maslow isn't mentioned anywhere in the book. I'm not myself sympathetic to Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, but I'm not going to talk about today. But we can see in passages like this, and the reason I wanted to mention it is that Quigley goes far beyond the ordinary scope of history and political science. In an appendix to Weapon Systems and Political Stability, A History, and titled The Structure of Revolutions with Applications to the French Revolution, Quigley takes up the problem of political stability in relation to revolutions, the latter being presumably the antithesis of political stability. And while he focuses on the French Revolution, he again takes an unusually wide and abstract view of revolutions. Quote, "Political stability is present in civilizations only when the distribution of political participation and political rights in the polities reflects the potential distributions of weapons in the society. When the distribution of weapons is wider than the polity of active citizens, the latter must be widened to obtain stability. When the distribution of effective weapons is much narrower than the polity should be narrowed in perception, if not in law, or there will be dangers of coup d'etat in which the possessors of weapons will change the personnel of the governments as established by the legal polity. Changes in the dimensions of the polity, a legal or constitutional issue, may be achieved by political reforms or by revolution, reformist to make the polity wider, fascist to make it narrower," unquote. This is a highly abstract way of opening a discussion about revolution, and this was Quigley's particular contribution, taking present historical problems and placing them in the most comprehensive context in order to understand them at their greatest degree of generality. Quigley's The Evolution of Civilizations, an Introduction to Historical Analysis, is one of the great works written on civilization. And here also he pursued the kind of abstraction and generality that many philosophers have come to avoid as a result of philosophical controversies over the very idea of a law of history, which has been, on the one hand, a perennial ambition of philosophers of history, but on the other hand, an ambition now widely regarded with suspicion and when it is not outright derided. Quigley opens a preface to The Evolution of Civilizations with this observation, quote, "This book is not a history. Rather, it is an attempt to establish analytical tools that will assist the understanding of history. Most historians will regard such an effort as unnecessary or even impossible." Unquote. The first chapter begins with an anecdote about searching for a perfect quartz crystal on a railroad embankment, a place that Quigley apparently visited many times in his youth, and he searched through mounds of quartz crystals, and none of them that he found perfectly matched the structure of quartz crystals described in books of minerals. Quigley then applied this lesson more generally to the sciences. Quote, "Later, when I studied science in school and college, I found that most scientific laws were of this idealized character. They were not statements of what actually happens in the world or what we observe through our senses, but rather were highly idealized and much oversimplified relationships that might occur if a great many other influences, which always are present, were neglected. I found that the most highly praised scientific laws attributed to great men like Galileo or Newton were of this character. It was a blow to discover that Newton's laws of planetary motion did not, in fact, describe the movements of the sun's satellites as we observe them, except in a very approximate way. In some cases, notably that of the planet Mercury, the approximation was by no means close," unquote. Proceeding along the same line of thought, he applied the same idea to the social sciences, but he found here that the attitudes of social scientists prevented them from making generalizations. Quote, "Still later, when my interests shifted from the physical sciences to the social sciences, I worked with students of human society who were generally lacking in any close familiarity with the natural sciences. I found a curious situation. The social scientists usually had erroneous ideas about the methods and theories of natural science, believing them to be rigid, exact, and invariable. Accordingly, they felt that these methods were not applicable to the social sciences. Thus, I found that natural scientists were quite prepared to accept as a law a rule that was only approximately true or is true in only one case in 100, while the social scientists were reluctant to accept any rule that was only approximate or even one that had no more than one exception in 100 cases," unquote. This, I think, is one of the most important realizations that anyone can arrive at. And the lack of this realization has compromised the social sciences as well as philosophy of the social sciences, which, under the influence of an exaggerated ideography, has enshrined the particularistic at the expense of the nomothetic. At present, this pendulum continues to swing in the ideographic direction, and even the physical sciences are tending in this direction. When the pendulum will swing back is anyone's guess. Quigley sought to bring this scientific understanding to the study of history and civilization, and he was partly successful as far as his own work extends. Yet, as we have seen in so many cases, Quigley had a great deal of influence on his immediate circle and his students, but few have attempted to build on his work. So far as I know, there is no Quigleyan school of historiography seeking to apply and to extend Quigley's insights. Possibly because history established its paradigm so early in Western history, with Herodotus and Thucydides, it has been nearly impossible to budge since that time, except for the most incremental developments. Occasionally, the exceptional thinker appears who questions the historical paradigm and tries to go beyond it, but they usually remain largely isolated. We could say that Quigley follows and builds upon Toynbee, so that he belongs to a larger Toynbeean school of historical thought. And there would be some justice in this claim, but I think making this claim would be more misleading than helpful. Quigley followed out his own program for a social science of history in his book on civilization. And precisely because there is no real Quigley in school, there is still much that we can learn from it because many of its lessons remain little known and little applied. Given Quigley's focus on civilization and on laws in social science, it's not surprising to hear him compared to Toynbee. It has been said that Quigley's thought is derivative of Toynbee, but while the influence was there and is unmistakable, at the same time, Quigley is strongly critical of Toynbee. For example, Quigley wrote, quote, Toynbee never defined his terms and constantly violated his own precepts in his own practice, unquote. Quigley analyzed the development of civilization into 7 stages, which he called mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. Here, Quigley is especially critical of Toynbee. He says that Toynbee failed to account for the early history of civilizations, which he has expanded and analyzed into the 4 movements of mixture, gestation, expansion, and conflict. Quigley wrote, quote, Toynbee's failure to provide a satisfactory analysis of process explains his failure to understand or to provide stages for the first part of a civilization's existence, unquote. Quigley also says that Toynbee failed to make a connection between his stages and his mechanisms. For Toynbee, the mechanism that drives civilization is challenge and response. But this movement of challenge and response is not reflected in the stages that Toynbee attributes to civilization. Quigley's analysis explicitly counters this, as his first 4 stages in the history of civilization are at the same time mechanisms by which civilizations develop. Economics is never far from Quigley's analysis in the evolution of civilization and appears throughout the book. And in this sense, Quigley reminds me in some ways of Peter Turchin in our own time. Last year, I read Turchin's End Times, and there was a very similar interest in understanding the economic mechanisms that drive societies and which, when they fail, cause societies to fail. Both Quigley and Turchin emphasize that when elites, and this is Turchin's term, not Toynbee's, when elites cease to invest their resource in the furtherance of the society of which they are part, that society breaks down and fails. For Quigley, this is another of the central mechanisms that accounts for civilizations. And I should note here that Quigley mostly uses societies interchangeably with civilizations. The third stage in the development of a civilization, which Quigley calls expansion, is at the heart of Quigley's exposition. And for Quigley, all civilizations possess what he calls instruments of expansion. This instrument of expansion is a complex process that consists of 3 elements, being inventiveness, a class of persons who accumulate surplus value, and the investment of the surplus value into new inventions or their applications. All 3 of these factors need to come together for a civilization to pass through its expansionary stage after cultural mixture and gestation of that mixture. That Quigley offers developmental periods that reflect the mechanisms of a civilization's development, and that he spells out the instrument of expansion as a mechanism is where he sees his account as going where Toynbee did not go, and it is the source of his criticism of Toynbee. If you say that Toynbee did have a mechanism, the mechanism of challenge and response, Quigley says, quote, Toynbee's process of challenge and response explains nothing, is based on a mistaken Darwinian biological analogy, and provides no technique for analyzing a society or for communication with others about it, unquote. Quigley closes his book, The Evolution of Civilizations, saying that he will review 6 chief points for the study of history and civilization, though he actually only names 5 points. He numbers these points in the text, but he passes over number 4. And maybe Quigley thought that his fourth point was obvious enough from the context, but I don't see an obvious but unnamed point between the third and fifth point. So I will only mention the 5 things that I did find in the text. So his chief points include a distinction between knowledge and understanding, that civilizations pass through cycles of rise and fall, periodization, vocabulary, and a method for dealing with history and social problems. And all of these are closely tied together. About the distinction between knowledge and understanding, Quigley says that knowledge is relatively easy to acquire. He seems to think of it as just a form of memorization. But understanding requires a self-conscious effort to understand what you're doing when you're trying to understand history. Next, his claim that civilizations pass through cycles of rise and fall. And he says, he immediately disclaims that there's any originality of it. He notes rightly that this is very much a cliche, but it's a cliche that he insists upon as being important. And he develops this theme, repeating one of the central themes of the book. We can say that one of Quigley's criticisms of Toynbee was that Toynbee failed to provide an explanatory mechanism for the development of civilizations. One of the mechanisms for which Quigley is known is what he calls the institutionalization of the instrument. Earlier, we saw that Quigley argued that the productive stage in the development of a civilization depended on an instrument of expansion. What he calls an instrument is important for his exposition. This is at the heart of his conception of civilization, because societies produce instruments to achieve certain ends, but the instrument transforms itself slowly into an institution that seeks only to perpetuate itself and ceases to fulfill its function as an instrument. When the instruments of expansion are institutionalized, civilizations fail and fall. Quigley's concern with periodization is that conventional periodizations are misleading and counterproductive as analytical tools. They tend to funnel scholars into specialization in what he considers to be unproductive lines of inquiry. We saw earlier that Quigley was critical of Toynbee failing to connect developmental stages through which a civilization passes to the mechanisms of civilization. This critique of periodization is of a piece with this criticism of Toynbee, because the two are, Quigley tries to furnish a periodization that reflects stages in the development of a mechanism, but for Toynbee, they don't come together. And so Quigley is objecting both to traditional periodizations and the periodization in Toynbee that he finds. Quigley's concern with vocabulary is that he has supplied a vocabulary that can be the basis of further work. And I said earlier that there is no Quigley School of History, but Quigley appears to hope that there would be. He wrote, quote, "The real point is that my vocabulary is fruitful in research projects, in arousing original questions and interpretations, and in making communications between historians more helpful," unquote. The old vocabulary is tied to old periodizations that Quigley has just criticized as unhelpful and misleading. Quigley explicitly acknowledges that his vocabulary isn't perfect, because no vocabulary is perfect, but it is better than what he inherited, and he clearly hoped that others would adopt it in their analyses. His final point recurs to his first point, which was the distinction between knowledge and understanding. The kind of understanding he wanted to convey to his students was how to deal with history and with social problems in general. He said frequently, and in the final section of the book, that he wanted to train executives rather than clerks. The idea being that clerks employ their knowledge, but the executive must have understanding. And he says that it's a poor executive who cannot hire people under him who have greater knowledge than him, and he makes use of that knowledge in his understanding of the situation for the furtherance of whatever aim is involved. And Quigley says that the historian should try to place himself at this executive level. Quigley also thinks that there is an applicability of this to the present, and he describes in the final section of the book how he had a classroom exercise in which he proposed to his students that they would be the head of a commission of inquiry sent to Brazil, and they would have to say what specialists they would want to bring with them, what kind of knowledge they would want to have access to, what kind of questions should be asked in order to have a successful inquiry. And he wrote, quote, "The techniques I have discussed as instruments for dealing with the past have value outside the study of history, for they are equally useful in dealing with the present or the future," unquote. I think anyone with a concern for the rational analysis of history, and this seems to me to be the proper attitude in philosophy of history, should be able to agree with Quigley on many of these points. Quigley wants a better historical analysis leading to a better understanding of civilization, and this doesn't necessarily entail an agenda. But I think there is a subtle ideal just below the surface in Quigley that appears when he discusses the nature of Western civilization as being distinct from the other civilizations he considers in his book. So let me try to give a hint of what I mean by this. In my episode on Nietzsche, I talked about how Nietzsche, after having been close to Wagner in his early years, broke with him, and years later, Wagner sent Nietzsche a copy of the score to Parzival. Nietzsche hated it, since for Nietzsche, Parzival represents the spectacle of the world saved by a fool. Quigley gives a very different interpretation of the Parzival story and makes it central to Western civilization. For Quigley, Parzival represents the core of truth-finding in Western civilization. And he writes, quote, "The earliest great work of German literature, Parzival, has as its subtitle, 'The Brave Man Slowly Wise.' This is typical of Western ideology's belief that wisdom, or any real achievement, comes as a consequence of personal effort in time," unquote. In that quote, Quigley emphasized the individual. In the next quote I will read, he emphasized the role of the community. Quote, "There are two important ideas here. One is that no one has the whole truth now, but that it can be approached closer and closer in the future by vigorous effort. And the other is that no single individual does this or achieves this, but that it must be achieved by a communal effort, by a kind of cooperation and competition in which each individual's effort helped to correct the errors of others, and thus help the development of a consensus that is closer to the truth than the actions of any single individual ever could be," unquote. And then a little further along, he adds, quote, "There is a third idea also, namely that the resulting consensus is still not final, though far superior to any earlier or more individual version," unquote. Here, Quigley's providing a sketch of Western individualism, but from the point of view of the community. I don't disagree with Quigley, but I would formulate this view from the point of view of the individual rather than from the point of view of the community. Individualism has a place in Western civilization that it does not have in other civilization. This is an overall economic benefit to Western civilization because it means that any individual can follow what they believe to be their calling, and they can invest their entire life into this. And if it goes badly, that individual loses their life. But the whole of society can just keep on going as though nothing happened. So you find, eccentric individuals who invest their entire life into a project and it comes to nothing. And there's a very low social cost to that. On the other hand, because people have this freedom of individualism to pursue their individual callings, some of these turn out to be wildly successful. And so If the individual fails to make anything of their individual quest, very little is lost. But if the individual is successful, the whole of society benefits from that success. So societies in which collectivism plays a larger role than individualism do not have this advantage. If I'm right in attributing this view to Quigley as the underlying spiritual ideal, never made fully explicit in his work, then one place in which he could have further illuminated his thesis would have been to show how this Western quest for wisdom through a social dialectic is integrated into the overall mechanisms of Western civilization. Happy birthday, Carroll Quigley. Let me know what I missed or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.